Thanksgiving. A couple of years ago, I began working at Vandersall Collective. Vandersall was started by an amazing human named Mieke Vandersall, who is a church planter, is a Presbyterian ordained Presbyterian minister. Also has started a number of successful nonprofits, and does fundraising in a different way than what I had come across prior. Well, Mieke always has taken an approach that ministry, that stewardship is a contextual ministry, and that within that context, we have to adapt and change. Things need to be out of the box. And I have learned so much from her these past 2 years. So I am excited that she and I have the time today to talk to you, because as we know, the context of all of our lives has shifted, and so too must our approach to stewardship. And with that, Mieke.
So we'll begin with a reading from the Gospel according to John, and then I'll take a few minutes and walk you through some of my reflections on this as we think about our money stories and how those stories that we have experienced and told and been told influence our particular anxiety in this time. So I'm grateful for your hopes and your fears that you've articulated, feeling like we really bring a lot of these fears and hopes into this reading and into our time together, holding them in the same place, in the same palm. So Erin, could you begin by reading us from John?
Sure. The Gospel according to John. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." And they said to him, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus...
Sorry, there we go.
But the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" And they answered him, "No." And he said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it. And now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. And that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and he jumped into the lake. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there, with fish on it, and bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead.
So could you go into the chat box and to all panelists and attendees, just write a word or phrase that stuck out to you in the reading? Thank you.
These are great, Mieke.
So as we are close to enter into Holy Week, very, very close, we meet a Jesus here who was betrayed by Judas and was paid off for his betrayal by the officials. It was like he learned nothing from Jesus about God's economy, the economy where values of competition, of our worth being tied to what we produce, of a debt-based predatory economy were upended in the stories he told in his parables and the way that he shared bread. In Luke's gospel, right after Judas was bought off, Jesus took bread and wine and shared it. And it was an incredible paradox. He told his disciples about the kingdom again, this place where we are concerned with everyone having enough, and our greatest concern is making sure our neighbor isn't suffering. In this reading that we chose for this afternoon, we fast forward to Easter, where we go through the death and resurrection, enter on the other side, not recognizing Jesus in our midst, nor the opportunities before us. In the guilt and fear and grief, disruption, confusion, the disciples did what they knew best. They fished. That's what they did. They didn't look to do things differently in the midst of chaos and crisis. They didn't even know how to just look on the other side of the boat. And I really get this in this time as crisis has hit, as trauma has deepened itself inside of me. I know how difficult it is to choose a different way of being. It's easier, if not harder at the same time, to go back to what we already knew, even though it doesn't work. It's easier, if not harder, to go back to the stories that we have experienced and have told and have been told about money and the power that it has in our lives. It didn't dawn on them or us that because of all the emotion, they needed to stop and reflect and realize that there are other options and other stories and that we could take them. So Jesus simply suggested that they try casting their net on the other side. And when they did it, there was so much there, and they dragged the fish into the land, and there was a fire waiting for them, and they knew Jesus again. This Jesus who found perspective encouraged the disciples to find it as well. Take this bread, break it in half, remember what it's like to share, where your value is not based on how much you give, where your seat at the table recognizes only that you're hungry and that you were called to feed others. Throw your net over the other side and see what's there. And there was enough for all of us, even in the midst of crisis. On the other side were things that we wouldn't expect, something we couldn't expect because we had stories in our beings, our bodies, our memories that coded our thinkings. Jesus again and again invites us into a different story than the one we've been told, and at least that I have bought and placed my trust in, hook, line, and sinker. I know the story well of the economy of the world, of my worth being connected to my ability to be effective, to produce, to provide, to be self-sufficient, alone, independent. And I forget too easily the economy that Jesus proposed and advocated for, telling us that this is a lie. Walter Brueggemann finds that the economic model based on biblical values is life and prosperity, wealth held provisionally, debt forgiveness, and the kingdom of God, rather than the stories we hear and live of fear of not having enough, of hoarding toilet paper, of being convinced that we don't have anything to give and that we can't ask others. So in our time together, we ground this in this story from John to invite your stories. The stories that we have lived and been told about money, what they have to do with our faith, and how they impact our ability to do basic human things that this time is calling us into. These basic human things of asking and giving and receiving, and how vulnerable these things make us, especially in times of stress and trauma. Also, I would like to say that this is the beginning of a conversation. Erin and I, at least I know, have been engaging in this story about what our money stories are for a very long time. Every time we get anxious, we begin to trip up on it again, noticing that the anxiety comes out of another place, needing to take that apart so that we can move forward living into God's call for us. And so this is the very, very beginning of this conversation of all of us here as a community, and we do encourage you to continue the conversation at the end, to call us, to talk with your vestries and your stewardship committees, to engaging in your stories and creating new ones, and asking yourself about the decisions that you are making, asking what story you're living out, and if you might be able to write a new one. So Erin, I turn it back to you.
Absolutely. And so, friends and colleagues, we believe and we know that to ask, to give, to receive are basic human functions. And that in that way that we've been created to do these things, then the ministry of stewardship is not over. It can't be over because we've been created to be connected to one another in that way. In this time, we're hearing, Mieke and I, from our clients, our fundraising clients, that many cannot continue to do their philanthropic work because we are in a bit of a train wreck right now. The more that we think this through, though, the more Mieke and I learn, the more information we gather about history, our collective story as a nation, also our individual stories. We're realizing that our money stories are guiding our ability to ask, to give, to receive. We're hearing from many that we're going to be going into another Great Depression. However, let's look at what actually happened during that time. Giving was, in fact, negatively impacted somewhat at the outset of the Great Depression, but indications are that giving actually did not decline dramatically in the immediate aftermath of the crash of 1929. In fact, the New York Times reported on December 8th, 1931, that giving to 155 community chests, so those are essentially predecessors to many of the causes that are found by nonprofits or United Way organizations, that giving to 155 community chests rose, you ready for this? 14.9% between 1930 to 1931. After the Depression, giving to charities and nonprofit organizations raised almost 15%. The 1950 Sage Foundation report also indicated that charitable giving increased overall in 1931. So what does that say about our money stories and how they're guiding us right now? For years, and both Mieke and I have talked about generational characteristics. We talked about how experience as early givers formed different generations as a collective whole to have particular characteristics in giving. And we all have been talking about that greatest generation that gave sacrificially, that continued to give sacrificially. And I think it's fascinating that many of them were formed during the Greatest Depression, and yet they are some of our most sacrificial givers still in our pews. I find a lot of hope in that. I find a lot of faithfulness in their narratives. And so as we think about generosity taking lots of different forms, we begin to ask, who are we to say where our generosity needs to be pointed? Who are we to say who can't give and who can? How much and how little? Who are we to say this person isn't worthy of our invitation? So we are forming givers, and we are being formed in new ways for great generosity right now.
If we take the opportunity.
If we take the opportunity. Mm-hmm. What then is our story as Episcopalians? I take great delight in thinking about stewardship in the frame of our own Episcopal denomination. In the Episcopal Church, through our baptismal covenant, we commit our lives to God in reconciliation to God and to one another. When fundraising is ministry, lives are transformed in the giving of gifts to change and repair a broken world as we reconcile ourselves to God. That's a story that I want to get behind. And so in stewardship, the stewarding of the gifts that God has given us for the glory of God, we begin to engage in right relationship to one another. So what does this mean? That means that when stewardship is a ministry, when we approach it as a pastoral, contextual ministry, lives are transformed in the giving of gifts to change and repair a broken world as we reconcile ourselves to God. How does this happen? It begins with the act of inviting and receiving an invitation. In that invitation, we're asked to consider our relationship to God, to money, and one another. It is deeply contextual. The ways that we engage in the stewarding of resources has to change. I was reminded today as I was taking out my garbage. I was taking out my garbage, and there's a fence that's between me and my neighbor that's across the alley. And I was yelling across about 10 feet over saying, "Randy, how are you doing?" He said, "I heard we're getting our stimulus checks coming here soon." I said, "That's what I heard too." And he said, "My daughter is going to give her stimulus check to her brothers because they need it more than she does." And then Randy went on to say, "And I am going to be giving my gift to a restaurant because I think that restaurant needs the money more than I do." When we talk about inviting as contextual, it means that this context is one in which we are still being formed for generosity. Some things change, but there are some things that don't. Jesus showed up again and again in relationship and believed that we all have something to give. What that might be changes, but we have something. And we as humans need to give repeatedly, engage in a cycle that is hard sometimes, but it's necessary to ask, to give, to receive. People are desperate for ways to feel that they can do something about this pandemic. Absolutely desperate. And they are scared. And we can help. And it's our responsibility to help channel our human, God-given needs. So there are a few things that we can do. And I invite Mieke to jump in as we walk through this together. The first item, check on your people. Talk with your donors. Use that checking in to ask these questions. Find out what they are giving, what they need. Equate your committee with caring. And tell them where you are. Be honest, where you actually are.
I was reading an article from the Chronicle of Philanthropy that just came out based on where we are as a nation right now, as a world right now. And the article said that nonprofits need to be speaking. And I would like to include churches in that. We need to be speaking because people are asking what to do and people want to make a difference. And the reality is that as churches, we are part of the landscape of spiritual doctors in this country. And we have an opportunity to give something that only us, that we are the only people who are able to give that in community with faith communities throughout this world. And so I think about the ways that not only do we need to be checking in on our donors and equating stewardship with caring, but also we have something in particular that we need to be speaking about right now. And that's where we are and what needs to happen so that we can continue to give the kind of service that this world desperately needs at this moment.
That's beautiful. I'm reminded actually, last week, Mieke and I did a webinar similar to this one for a diocese. The Diocese of Upper South Carolina invited its clergy to participate. And one of the clergy members said that she realized that the congregation she would be gathering again, when we are all able to gather, was going to be dramatically different from the one that she previously knew. And that realization was something that she was praying through and thinking about. And it reaffirmed to me why checking on our people is so important. Because oftentimes Mieke and I are asked for concrete strategies, and we've got lots. We're happy to provide them. Right now, especially, we know that folks need them. But you all know your people. And the only way to continue to know your people is to check in on them, to ask, to grow together. Because you are not meeting together on a Sunday morning does not mean you don't have the opportunity to grow and be church together now. And that means reaching out and asking. So that leads me to the second item on the list, which is ask people for things. The old folks among us could write or tell stories about getting through adversity, reflections on their money stories. Young people often can be passionate about things like the environment and can tell about hopes and dreams about their money stories as well.
That we really need to be able to hear so that we can help to construct this world to a place where they will inherit and that they will be glad to inherit.
Absolutely right. This is once again also a chance for you to continue to stay connected to the context that's being formed through your people. Mieke, do you mind if I tell this strep throat story?
Yes. No, I don't mind. And can I say one thing before you do that? As we ask people for things, one of the greatest, I think, rules around fundraising is that no matter when we meet with people, whenever we meet with people, we need to make sure that we are always asking.
That's right.
It's not always for money. It might be for time. It might be for reflection. It might be for praying for your community. It might be for hosting a party once we're able to gather together in person. But there is something really important in people being able to give, and we therefore need to ask in order to give up people the opportunity to be able to do that and be open to whatever someone might be asking of you. So just wanted to connect one of the rules of fundraising alongside our faith communities in that way.
I love that. So a few years ago, so I have two children, and my youngest, Simon Henry, was 5, and I realized that he and I likely had strep throat. And in order to determine, we had to go into the doctor, and we were going to have to be swabbed by this awful Q-tip. And whenever you're swabbed by the Q-tip, my experience is I have to work really hard not to throw up or cry. And I was dreading taking in my 5-year-old to do that. And so we go into the doctor's office, and the doctor, because the doctor knew my son, knew that there was going to have to be some magic that took place. So she created like a whole world where there was stories and sounds and distraction. And it took about 10 minutes before the actual test took place, but she was wonderful. And then she turned to me, and she knew me, and she knew I did not need all that magic to happen. I just wanted it to be done quickly. And that's exactly what she did. She took into account our characteristics and what she knew of us, and she adapted her model accordingly, which is what happens every single time that we enter a room with someone in a pastoral context. We keep in mind, whether it be a hospital bed, which is difficult to do right now because most of us are not allowed in hospitals, but whether it be a hospital bed or an in-person visit, we take into account whether there's considerations around a person's gender or age, racial makeup, whether another person needs to be in the room, mental impairment. These are all things we take into account. And so too now, there are particular contextual needs to take into account. And the way to have a better sense then of what your context is to reach out and talk to people. And then, as Mieke described, be prepared to ask for things. Mieke, would you walk us through the third item?
We have touched a bit on honest communication already, but I've been seeing some churches who are out of their money narrative stories, are desperate to make sure that they keep the lights on. And so I've seen some fundraising pitches that have really been around, make sure to give online or send us your check because you're not here on Sunday so that we can have the lights on when you come back. While that might be honest in a certain way, I believe that it's missing the point of why we are together. The lights are on so that we can be community with each other. The church buildings might be closed, but the church is open. And so as we are asking for financial resources, digging into the ways that we serve the community around us and the neighborhood that we live in, think about your messaging, not out of a place of desperation for survival, but as a place for hope for the future and what that might bring. Setting goals, Erin.
That's great. So the desperation piece is a huge component as well when thinking about goal setting. Now is a time where we do need to continue thinking about how we invite people to give. And there are lots of different strategies, but strategies need to be informed by what your larger goal is. Is your goal going to be, we're going to increase funding for our outreach ministry? If so, your messaging and strategy will need to reflect that. Is your goal that we're going to create a number of different vehicles so that we can see new donors, because there are new people that are viewing our Facebook Live feed now, our Facebook Live worship service? That's great. Then your strategies need to reflect that. Set goals. And both Mieke and I believe, long-term goals are important, but right now, especially short-term goals make things feel manageable. And frankly, the information is shifting so much that a goal that you set last week might need to change or adapt this week. And so that is okay. We are getting lots of information and a lot of data, and our goals might need to reflect that changing nature. But we can only work towards something that we can see and know and measure. And in that way, keeping a goal in front of you is going to be important. Did you have more to add, Mieke?
Just that agreeing with you, and the feeling of accomplishment in times when we feel so out of control can be very, very helpful. Yeah. Not as a way to beat yourself up if you don't reach it, which is perhaps why chunking our days out in measures of time and measures of interaction is important. It can be very overwhelming to need to check in with your whole parish, but breaking those apart between vestry members, stewardship members, leadership members, it's actually not as bad as it sounds. It's not as overwhelming as it might sound at the beginning. So having clear, measurable goals around communication, around fundraising, not only helps yourself, but it helps the people that you're interacting with.
That's great.
So I think that we have, depending on how chatty we are and how many questions we have, we could have some time for conversation, for questions to be put into the chat. And then at the very end, we have a few, announcement ways that we think that we could be helpful to you, and an invitation to complete a little bit of homework and continue the conversation with us. So lots of questions, and they don't need to be questions, could just be thoughts that you're having based on what we've talked about so far. Let them come in if there are any.
Mieke, it might be helpful if you describe what the homework is, and then that way if people had questions about the homework, they could raise it now.
Sure. So what we'll be doing is sending you a piece of just a handout, the rapid fire exercise, where we have some clauses that we hope you to fill in. We hope that you'll take some time filling in the blank. Like, I believe there are seven of them, I think, and there's like, I believe God believes that rich people are, fill in the blank. God believes that poor people are, fill in the blank. They're very simple little questions, but very revealing about our particular stories and what we've been told and what we have internalized, which then begins to reveal to us what some of the deeper work that we need to engage in.
That's terrific. Thank you.
Anything from you all?
As we're thinking about questions and looking for thoughts or considerations from our participants, Mieke and I have seen these biographical stories play out in all sorts of different models. One of our clients, a group that is very much a network-based group, the leaders were a bit resistant in calling people initially. And Mieke, what ended up happening as they explored their money narratives and began to reach out?
We had a 5-hour money narrative, money story training, and as we began to go through those narratives and tell them to each other, and then begin to ask people for things that they needed, ask other members of their community for things they needed, they got really excited. And in this crazy time that we were in, they decided that they were actually going to set a give or get goal to raise money to be able to continue doing their work in this time. So they began to really transform themselves from thinking that we are bothers when we call people and ask, to understanding that we are actually giving opportunities and engaging in community. So it was really, really cool to watch that happen. So I think, Erin, it doesn't look like there are questions or thoughts for now. Oh, we have something coming in from Jerome. Thank you. My immediate thought is that my responses to that fill in the blank question is so much multi-layered. Exactly. It's hard to accurately use the word or phrase. Well, it is. And what is most interesting to me is the very first word or phrase that comes to your mind. That is what's coming from our subconscious to be thought through. I've found that the fill in the blank thing is, as long as we don't overthink it, can be really revealing around what we think about humanity, where we place our trust, and how that can be transformed. So yes, it's multi-layered and intentionally tried to be simple so that it can open a larger conversation.
And these questions, they can be used for individual church leaders, or they can be sent out to congregations, for congregations to have larger conversations about who are we in the midst of this crisis. You know, I'm reminded, Mieke, of a campaign that we did for a church that will not be named, where we were there and we were raising money and for a large project, and there was someone who came up to us willing to give a substantial gift. I believe it was about $500,000 for this church. But she said, my only requirement is that we need to make sure this gift remains anonymous. I don't want any of my clergy to know, because the last time I tried to give a gift, the clergy made me feel bad. And I said, well, say more about that. And she said, well, the clergy kept on apologizing for the fact that they needed the gift. It kept on saying, I'm so sorry that we are in this place. And so right now, as we are all in very different places, it would be easy for us to apologize, or it would be easy for us to feel our own feelings about money. But then there are larger ramifications about what happens and how other people are impacted by our money stories. And so I think that's a really good segue, Mieke, into how can we at Vandersall Collective help you?
Sure. As you can imagine, as a consulting firm, we are shifting as the ground underneath us is shifting, and we're finding ways to meet our clients where they are, knowing that the landscape has changed and will continues to on a daily basis. Erin and I had a lot of travel planned for this spring, and our best laid plans are certainly being sidetracked, and we're working through all the disorientation that's coming. The gospel lesson that we read today, however, does reorient me to remember that we're not the first or the last to go through something traumatic like this, and that all of the feelings of now will pass and will be replaced with others. So we're finding new ways to serve, knowing that we initially were in triage mode, knowing that with time, new things will seep in and will stabilize a bit, and then we'll begin to need thinking about the future. So we have put together a few offerings of 3 curated conversations, much more much larger, more in-depth conversations that we are leading via Zoom with congregations or with small committees. And we thought that we would just tell you about those today. One is our money stories, similar to what we talked about today, but more interactive and going deeper with our own particular stories. The second is around reaching people, communicating how we do this in the crisis time that we are in right now. We have a communication wing of our firm, and the consultants that we work with who do communications in particular really enjoy conversations around interrupting isolation through human connection, and how we can do that through communicating, not just through words on a page, but how we interact with each other. And the third is a question around how we are a community. We are finding a multiplicity of ways of engaging with each other, and churches are just adapting very quickly, no doubt yours as well, as we're moving all of our worship services and prayer services online, and my knitting circle is now online, and I know families are getting together through FaceTime for dinners. There are great opportunities here in how we gather as community, because there's been so much disruption in how we do it that we don't take anything for granted any longer. So through the third curated conversation, we would explore the particularity of neighborhood and community and brainstorm ways to stop the urge to fill in the gap of business as usual, and trying to go back to business as usual, to resist that, but enter into some of the creativity that this time can offer. So those are three of the offerings, and again, we can do these with leadership teams, with smaller groups, with larger groups, and are engaging with clients in a whole different kind of set of ways than we're used to. We're used to longer term engagements, but are doing much shorter chunks as we're going through the period of triage to then the period of reflection and then the period of action again. Erin, anything else on that? Oh, also, we'll send you the homework, and we'll also send you some resources, including stewardship curriculum that will be coming out. Erin has written, as part of that stewardship curriculum, a children's curriculum, which we don't really think there are many children's stewardship curriculum out there. We've done that with a Sanctified Art, which is another small firm. So we'll send that out via Joe in the SEEP network afterwards. And we do hope that you will send us back your homework and can have a time with us. We would love to pro bono set up a time to talk with you through that and what you're thinking, and help you think about what's going on in your community. Erin, anything else?
No, that's perfect. So I'm going to ask, we began with a word, and now I want to close our time out with a word. Invite you all to notice how you are feeling at the end of this hour together. Mm-hmm. What is your body saying? What is your mind saying? How are you feeling now? If you would write that in the chat box, we'd love to hear from you. And this will be our prayer of gratitude today. I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for your time. And
thank you to SEEP for organizing this.
Thank you for Joe and Joe's continued ministry through SEEP. Absolutely. Please be well, and know that we are just a call away if you need anything.
Yeah. Thank you all.
Take care.